Today, a tale of two speeches, the credit crunch and the bear. Hello again, I'm Martin North, the Principal Analyst at Digital Finance Analytics. Today I want to discuss two speeches made in the past 24 hours or so. The first was by RBA Governor Philip Lowe in Adelaide last night. He highlighted ongoing low inflation and wage growth, despite a pickup in business investment, as well as continuing high household debt and the prospect that the next rate move will likely be up. But the main news was the official confirmation that lending is going to tighten in Australia, as we've been predicting. The RBA board kept the cash rate unchanged at 1.5%, and it has been that way since August 2016. That's for 21 months, which is the longest period without a change. Now, they think the economy is stronger than a year ago, and business conditions are around their highest level for many years, and the long-awaited pickup in non-mining business investment is taking place, he said. There's been a large pickup in infrastructure spending in some states, and the number of Australians with jobs has also grown strongly over the past year. The unemployment rate is lower than it was a year ago, although there has been little change for the past 6 months. Growth in consumer spending has been solid, he said, although it is lower than it was before the financial crisis. And turning to inflation data, both CPI and underlying inflation were running marginally below 2%. Strong competition in retailing is holding down the price of many goods. For example, over the past year, the price of food increased by just 0.5%. The price of clothing and footwear fell 3.5%, and the price of household appliances fell 2.5%. Importantly, he said, these outcomes are helping to offset some of the costs of living pressures arising from higher electricity prices, which nationally are up 12% over the past year. Another factor influencing recent inflation outcomes is a subdued growth in wages. Increases in wages of around 2% have become the norm in Australia, rather than the 3 to 4% mark that was the norm a while back. So the finances of some households are under strain, especially those who borrowed on the basis that their incomes would grow at the old rate. And in terms of the inflation target, inflation is expected to remain low at around its current level for a while yet, before, he said, gradually increasing over the next couple of years towards 2.5%. A key element here is the pickup in wages growth. Domestically, he said, for some time the main risk is related to household balance sheets. For a while, trends in household credit were quite concerning. On this front, he said, things now look less worrying than they were a while back, although the level of household debt remains very high, which carries certain risks. There is the potential for some tightening in financial conditions in Australia, and in the United States, the cost of US dollar funding has increased for reasons not directly related to monetary policy, and this increase is flowing through into the higher money market rates in Australia. We expect some of this to be reversed in time, he said, although it is difficult to tell by how much and when. It is also possible that lending standards in Australia will be tightened further in the context of the current high level of public scrutiny. And he said that the RBA will continue to watch these issues carefully. Now, I'm still amazed that household credit is being allowed to grow at 3 times income or CPI. So I question his statement that things now look less worrying than they were a while back. On this front, household debt has never been higher, and rates are indeed set to rise. So now to Wayne Byers, APRA's chairman, who spoke on Beyond the Bear necessities at the University of New South Wales Centre for Law Markets and Regulation seminar in Sydney. It's a timely topic given recent events. He looks at the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, or BEAR, which is due to commence formally from the 1st of July 2018. He also touched on the relative roles of APRA and ASIC and the potential overlap. And he said that financial institutions operate in a privileged position in society, and yet consumers have difficulty in assessing financial products, which often require long-term commitments, and consumers are forced to use them, for example, superannuation. He argued that trust is the cornerstone of a financial business, that the Australian financial system is financially sound, but they are far less trusted to do the right thing. And he regards this as a less fatal flaw than the lack of financial soundness, which tells you something about APRA's DNA. So he says that combination of compulsion, opacity, and materiality generates a quid pro quo, a heightened expectation that financial institutions will exhibit high standards of behaviour in the way they operate. The community will be far more likely to maintain its trust that the sector will do the right thing if it is evident that there is accountability when it does not. And APRA has had an increasing interest in the risk culture of financial institutions, and he admits, by the way, that there is some crossover with ASIC. ASIC, reflecting its own mandate, will take an interest in shortcomings that lead to damaging outcomes for consumers and markets. APRA, on the other hand, has an interest in failings in governance, culture, and accountability that indicate a lax attitude to risk-taking, which might ultimately impact the soundness of the financial institution itself and thereby jeopardise the interests of depositors, policyholders, and superannuation fund members. Then he looked at the BARE, which imposes substantially strengthened requirements in relation to accountability within banking organisations. In its design, the BARE draws its inspiration, he said, from the senior manager regime, SMR, in the UK. However, the BARE is narrower in coverage. The BARE applies only to ADI groups and deals primarily with matters relating to prudential standing and reputation of the ADI. For this reason, the BARE is naturally administered by APRA. The joint administration between the Prudential Regulatory Authority, the PRA, and the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, reflects the wider range of institutions and behaviours that are covered by the SMR. He said, were the BARE to be broadened at some stage in the future, a similar joint administration might well be appropriate in Australia, but until then, it is framed with a prudential focus and hence administered by a prudential regulator. The BARE formally comes into effect on the 1st of July 2018. In practice, though, he said implementation occurs over time. The new regime applies to the largest banks from day one, but other ADIs have a further year before they are subject to the BARE. There are also additional transitional provisions within the legislation, from a requirement that allows ADIs 3 months to register their accountable persons to allowing until the end of 2019 to accommodate the remuneration requirements in pre-existing executive employment contracts. So it will be some time before the BARE is fully in force. Broadly, there are 5 main elements to the BARE: registration, obligations, accountability, remuneration, and sanctions. So first, the BARE prescribes a set of accountable persons. These are essentially the directors and senior executives responsible for an ADI's overall health and well-being. The BARE requires accountable persons to be registered with APRA before they can perform their duties. But unlike the UK SMR, there is no scope for regulatory approval of appointments, nor any process of interviews. That is a deliberate choice. It maintains accountability for senior appointments where it rightly belongs, with the boards and senior executive teams that are making the appointments. However, unlike the current process, which only requires an ADI to notify APRA after an appointment, the BARE requires an executive to be registered prior to taking up duties. While APRA will not be vetting all appointments, the pre-appointment registration does provide an opportunity. He said, should we be aware of information that might make an appointee unsuitable, to discuss any concerns with the individual or the employing ADI. Second, new statutory obligations apply to both accountable persons and ADIs. These obligations require each to first act with honesty and integrity, secondly, with due skill, care and diligence, and thirdly, deal with APRA in an open, constructive and cooperative way. In doing so, they must take reasonable steps to prevent matters arising which would undermine the ADI's prudential standing and prudential reputation. Existing requirements in APRA's prudential standards already requires that responsible persons possess the competence and character to perform their roles. But there is no explicit obligation at present to be open and cooperative with APRA, or any formal obligation to prevent matters arising that would undermine the ADI's prudential standing and reputation. Third, each accountable person needs to have an accountability statement setting out the aspects of an ADI's operation for which they are accountable. Each ADI must have an accountability map showing how the statements come together to cover the totality of an ADI's business and risks. Together, the map and accompanying statements establish clarity on the allocation of accountability across the executive team within an ADI. He said this is probably the most important element of the BEAR. In many ADIs, there is often collective responsibility for various aspects of its business. For any given process or product, there are often handoffs of responsibility, including at times to external partners and suppliers. But this creates the risk of collective responsibility leading to no individual accountability. Clarity of accountability, the foundation of the BEAR, goes to the heart of a strong risk culture, he said. Some executives and directors in the largest ADIs, not all of whom were fans of the BEAR, acknowledge the benefits that the accountability statements and maps can bring them from a business perspective. The complexity of organisational structures with the separation of product manufacturing, distribution and operations makes it challenging to ensure it is clear who is responsible when things are not as they should be. Clearer accountabilities can only be beneficial. Next, clearer accountabilities can also improve remuneration outcomes. It is not uncommon for performance metrics within executive scorecards to be weighted more heavily to the performance of the institution rather than the individual. While this promotes a collegiate whole-of-organisation focus, on the other hand, it can also permit poor risk outcomes and a particular line of business to be averaged out across the business as a whole, reducing the impact on the executives most accountable and potentially undermining effective risk management. Clearer accountabilities should allow for more targeted scorecards and thereby greater alignment between the outcomes an individual delivers and the rewards he or she receives. The BEAR requires ADIs to defer a minimum proportion of an accountable person's variable remuneration, generally 40% for executives or 60% for the CEO of a large bank, for a minimum of 4 years. It also requires ADIs to have remuneration policies that provide for the reduction in variable remuneration should an accountable person fail to comply with their obligations, and to exercise the provisions should circumstances warrant it. Contrary to some beliefs, however, the BEAR does not grant APRA any power to determine what amount of remuneration an individual should receive. The basic requirements of the BEAR, a remuneration policy and provision for the reduction of variable remuneration when warranted, are in place today. But compared to today, the BEAR introduces the prescribed minimum deferral amounts and terms and creates a stronger link to the statutory obligations he referred to earlier. The BEAR will therefore mean accountable persons have more skin in the game for a longer period of time than is typically the case now, and will place greater pressure on ADIs when adverse prudential outcomes occur, to explain that it has been factored into remuneration outcomes. As a result, the BEAR will require many ADIs to restructure their remuneration frameworks. The BEAR provides an opportunity to fundamentally rethink remuneration frameworks and achieve a stronger alignment with long-term financial safety and a strong risk culture. It will be a lost opportunity if everyone just defaults to the minimum. And finally, there are sanctions. These apply at two levels, the ADI and the individual. For ADIs, the BEAR provides a penalty regime in instances where the ADI has failed to meet its obligations under the legislation. Put simply, failing to operate with integrity, skill, care and diligence, or preventing the prudential standing or reputation of the ADI from being materially undermined. APRA cannot impose the fines unilaterally. APRA must make a successful case before the courts. That will require APRA to have a belief as to its reasonable grounds for success and that the offence is material. For individuals, the financial sanctions for any failure to fulfil their obligations will be addressed via the ADI's remuneration policy. An APRA's sanction is a disqualification power, the power to remove an accountable person from their role, and in the most extreme cases, prevent them from taking on any similar role in the industry in the future. This is obviously not a power that will be used lightly, but appropriate and useful where necessary to eliminate known poor behaviour, endangering prudential safety. Now he says many aspects of the BARE are already present in APRA's prudential framework, and the BARE has been framed from a prudential perspective. And in that sense, the BARE should be viewed as a major strengthening of APRA's prudential framework, not an expansion of its mandate. And the BARE is not dissimilar to a number of other management responsibility, fitness and regimes that are administered by APRA's prudential peers in other jurisdictions. But I want you to note that the BARE is narrow. It applies only to ADI groups and deals primarily with matters relating to prudential standing and the reputation of the ADI. So the broader customer-related issues are off the radar. And the changes are really quite marginal, and this will not be sufficient to deal with the issues at hand. So putting the two speeches together, we see further confirmation of credit tightening from the RBA and weak and narrow enforcement from APRA via the BARE. Actually, it's more like a teddy bear. I don't really think that we have the regulatory settings right at the moment, but it's clear that everyone is wanting to steer well away from that can of worms. But to be clear, that is the very issue which now needs to be examined. Would the Royal Commission please step up? If you like what you've seen here today, please like the post and add a comment or a question. I read them all. If you want to join the growing band of subscribers who receive alerts when we release new posts, do subscribe now. And I want to thank those who have already subscribed. I really appreciate your support and participation. I'm Martin North, the Principal Analyst at Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.